frustrating me. Like I can't seem to get like whittled down to the kernel of what I'm trying to say. Um, and so instead, like, that last thing I recorded is really, when I watch it back, it's a bit cringy because it's kind of just circular and it's not precise, but I thought that's okay. It's me thinking out loud. Um, so there
It's
is,
paint on the canvas though.
that's it.
And yeah, I feel like there's a lot to work with there. And yeah, I have many thoughts and resonances and places I'd love to explore. But yeah, we can,
That's
maybe that's a
great.
separate
No, that's
conversation because
wonderful.
I
No,
feel
no,
like
that's wonderful.
there's like 7 hours of stuff we could talk about.
No, we could.
Yeah,
And I find that usually I start to get going in these conversations at about 2 hours in. So, and
right,
then,
right, right.
do you have a time that you want to finish up by two? I should ask.
Probably, I'd say probably 2 hours
Yeah, perfect.
from now or so. If that works for you,
That works for me. I think that's what I set this as anyway. So there you go. We're already resonating.
great, great. Yeah.
I know as well that like, how do you want to frame, I'm happy just to talk and then kind of just
Hmm.
use it however. I'm no good at doing introductions and that sort of thing.
Yeah,
Um,
that's
are you
fine.
good with that? Like sort of just a
No,
hard
that's yeah, no, that's fine. And I don't think I think the you getting to know me is kind of the introduction. Like
yeah,
you don't really have much to work with right
yeah.
now. So yeah, no, I'd love to just talk. And if
Okay.
I find too, like with the podcast that I do, like the frames often form themselves within the conversation, and then you know there's a title for the video somewhere in there
Yeah.
that just kind of reveals itself. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. All right, cool. I'm good with that.
Cool.
So do you want to just, in terms of, I know you have questions around the anger stuff. Should we just, I'm happy for you to jump in and ask me questions. Should we just talk?
Yeah. Sure, sure. Yeah.
Mhm.
Um, well, I'd love to kind of so there was something that I, I watched the video that you made the
Mm.
kind of just riffing on it. And there was this I think it's kind of been there, this hypothesis of kind of the utility or the function of like healthy anger.
Oh,
And I was wondering if it was okay if I shared an anecdote from my life that kind of just
oh yeah.
frames that for me. Um,
Yeah, lovely. Because
so
I get
yeah,
to know
yeah.
you as well.
So
Yeah.
so this was about 2 years ago. I was with a friend and we were out camping on the Pacific coast of Northern California, and we were at this. It was like a lagoon that like connected to the ocean, so like it was affected by the ocean's tide, but it was like it was like the separate body of water,
Mm.
and it was very windy, and it was like a characteristically California coast day, windy, blustery, water's very cold, and we courageously or naively, depending on who you talk to, decided to swim across to this little like
Mm.
island area. And we get there and we're shivering and we're cold. And I start to swim back first, and I see this, and the tide's like really strong. Like I can feel it like pulling me to the side. Like, I'm trying to go straight, but so I'm expending a lot of energy just trying to get back.
Mm.
And I see this group of like maybe 5 kids, and they're probably 6 to 8 years old, and they're on the kind of bank of the lagoon, and they're like screaming. But it's like, I don't know if you've ever had the experience of like hearing kids and you don't know if they're screaming for joy or screaming in terror. And I
Yeah.
didn't and
Every
I was
day. That's
also like,
every day here.
right, right,
Yeah.
yes. And I was just trying to get back myself, and so I was kind of like preoccupied with just my own self. And so I swim back, and then I realize after I get out that like they're seriously in trouble. And my friend's behind me swimming back, and he ends up actually, helping them out and, getting them to safety and everything. And we walk them back to their parents, and they must be like either cousins or family friends because there's like a lot of adults there. And we explained to them like your kids could have they could have drowned, like they could have seriously been injured. and they just seemed to like not care like at all.
Wow.
Like they were like, oh, that's just them like getting into trouble. And I remember like walking away and I was so angry. Like I was like infuriated.
Yeah.
And I was telling my friend, and I was angry at myself too for like kind of not going over and helping. Like I felt
Mm,
kind of cowardly in that.
mm,
And I realized afterwards, like that moment really stuck with me that like one of the m most angry I get at like ex
yeah.
experiences out in the world that aren't my own are negligent parents.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
there's a whole reason, you know, I mean, we can go into that with like my own history and trauma and stuff, but like this hypothesis started to form that like anger is in res like underneath anger is care. And anger is this expression that the circumstances right now are not conducive to healthy connection and care. And like the kind of fuel that anger can provide, if you know, if you think about it in like a systems theory framework, is like
Mm,
allowing one to enact a first order change to create a new homeostasis, right? Like, you know, you're angry at your partner because they seem to be so preoccupied with work that they can't connect with you, that you sit them down and you kind of express your needs. And you were kind of talking about this in
yeah.
the video of people who kind of suppress their anger, kind of lose their backbone, and they kind of become very passive and they kind of just deny their own needs.
Yeah.
And so there really seems to be this thing around anger of like
Mm,
it's a reaction to your
mm,
needs not being met.
yes.
Um, so maybe we can pause there and you can kind of
Mm,
react to that, disagree with it, agree with it, whatever. And then I think there's a second piece of like, okay, how do we react in a virtuous way that's
mm,
aligned with
yeah.
connection as opposed to disconnection? Because I think a lot of people can agree with that first part, but I think
Mm,
where a lot of people go wrong, I mean, myself included, I'm sure all of us,
mhm,
is we take that and then we kind of get really self-righteous around it of like, yeah, you screwed me over, and this violent expression of anger that just repels
mhm,
people,
mhm,
and doesn't it's kind of this vomiting of anger that doesn't lead to transformation. And it's like,
mhm,
how do we act skillfully
mhm.
around anger?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, so I'll just kind of leave it there, and you can go wherever you want with that.
Mm. Beautiful questions. Really, really beautiful questions. I'm already so alive in talking to you. And this is really great. And really insightful the way you're talking about anger. It's very, I can already hear is very aligned with how I am working with it in the therapy room. Um, I think like what you're pointing to there with noticing, like being reflective enough and honest enough with yourself to notice that, there's this link for you between anger and negligent parenting, right? Um, and that, for different people, it's going to be different. Like it might be a link between anger and the narcissistic parent, the parent
Hmm.
that violates boundaries. Like it could be the opposite kind of direction as opposed to like neglect. It might be more that there was a forceful kind of parent who so what I think the way that I would talk about maybe what you're pointing to is um, there's obviously the longing, the urge for connection, and then there's also the need for autonomy of some type,
Yeah.
right? And so
Hmm.
obviously these are two sides of the same, coin. Um, and so when you talk about one, you are sort of talking about the other necessarily in my mind. And so I think maybe like there's something about anger here that is helping us to as a signal, if we use it in the right way, might be helping us to get that balance right. Like it's kind of letting us know when that's off. Like um, either it's anger towards having a propensity for anger towards noticing that connection is not available in the way that you would like, or you believe is fair, or that you need. Right? So noticing the difficulty for connection. But then for some people, it's the other way. It's like an anger can be about noticing not having enough space or sort of ability for autonomy for self. being able to be different to your partner, have a different set of opinions and preferences, and not have that be some huge problem, like not having to bend and curtail to the other and serve the other and be of supply to the other all the time. And obviously, there are important elements to being able to do both pieces of that, but it's how do we find the balance? Like it's really hard, obviously really hard in relationship, to navigate remaining connected while also being able to retain some sense of autonomy and self, and not having to just be for the other, if that makes sense. So I'm just thinking as you were talking through that maybe what we're pointing to here is that anger is the thing that becomes alive inside us to let us know
Mm-hmm.
that something's failing, like in terms of that balance. And that for some people, based on their relational early life history, they will have a tendency for it to more likely show up on one side of that spectrum versus the other. But that I think it's always there trying to help us navigate how do I sort of retain being myself and having my own sets of desires and preferences and needs and will and agency in the world, but also obviously wanting to be very connected to people. Like connection is vital too,
Yeah.
right? That's quite a difficult dance. And so maybe I see, and maybe that links actually to that backbone comment. Like I do see anger as
Yeah.
it gets our attention, like it's designed to, right? It's something that sort of catches our attention,
Yeah.
and is letting us know something important about thing like justice, things being right. Like there's something not right about the way that those parents are responding to the fact that their children almost died. I mean, we see that on the beaches here in Australia all the time. Like my husband has had to save like kids from the surf quite a few times, and the
Mm.
difference, yeah, it goes one of two ways, right? You have the parents that then start screaming at their children because they're so embarrassed. So then it's also about the parent being embarrassed. It's not about the child.
The
And then you
kid.
have the
Yeah.
parents that, yeah, downplay the whole thing, right? Like, oh, it was nothing. And that if we really boil that down, it's really about, I think, avoiding guilt. But anyway,
Yeah.
that's me.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think maybe what we're getting at here is that anger is the thing that helps us know that that's out of balance. Perhaps we might need to stand up for something, whether that be a standing up for I'm not okay with sort of the manner in which connection is being offered here or not offered here, um, or it's a letting one know that maybe they are ignoring themselves too much, and there's like a
Mm-hmm.
repression going on, and the anger can be a signal of that. I think
Yeah.
there's something in that. Um, and then this
So
other,
I,
yeah, no,
yeah.
jump in because you asked
Yeah.
the second part, but
Yeah.
I can hold
Well,
it.
I was just, so like it sounds like there's resonance and there's kind of agreement with this idea that like anger is a is a signal kind of from our
Mm,
subconscious or psyche, um
mm,
pointing us in the direction of like something that we're not attending to, or something that's like a perceived, I mean it's a perceived danger, or threat in a lot of cases. And so I was hoping to go a level deeper
yes.
into the ways we react to our anger, because you were like one thing you mentioned in the video that you felt like I could really tell it was like, I think what was really alive for you that you felt like wasn't being addressed in the net conversations is like, why does our anger make us so anxious?
Mm,
And I think all these examples of, either the parents who get, extremely inflamed, or the parents that downplay it, is like it's a different manifestation of anxiety around the anger. Like the one parent is kind of seeking to control, and so they kind of have this outburst of anger when they feel like they can't control their child. Their
mm,
child
mhm,
runs off into the ocean without, them being able to like,
mhm,
wrangle them back in. Or the other parent that like is anxious about taking responsibility for the fact that their child is in this situation that they probably could have prevented, and the shame around a parent who like can't manage their children's impulsive,
Yeah.
reactions and that. So like I'm I'm I'm
Yeah.
wanting to get curious about in the therapy room for you. I mean, there's observations that I've had in my own life, and like just doing therapeutic adjacent work of how people react to their anger. But how does that manifest in the therapy room? And then I guess more importantly, why does that seem to happen?
Mm,
And what does it point to about how we were programmed to
mm,
react to our anger
mm.
from very early on?
Yeah. 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 So, well, so the mode of therapy I use, ISTDP, um,
Mm,
has a very particular way of understanding what is going on here. So it's quite difficult to put into words. Okay, so there is being able to talk about what happens for us when we get angry. And then there is, and sort of working through that in a talking way, right? And then there's the experiential. So it's a very experiential therapy. So we are actually trying to elicit feelings in the therapy and have them be there in their fullest capacity in the therapy. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to help the person see all the automatic ways that they are avoiding the full experience of that feeling in the room, even just talking to me about it. So if I
mhm,
had the parent, say that my client was the parent that you were talking about, who's telling me the story of, some guy brings the kids over and says, well, they almost drowned, and they're telling me what happened for them in that moment, the parent. Um, it would be to really slow down that example, if that example is characteristic of a problem for them, but it would be to really slow down that example and show them, point out to them how quickly they are moving along from it, or they are dismissing things, or they are applying logic too quickly, minimizing, going into teary, weepy, regressive defenses, like getting very childlike and hopeless, um, being defiant to the therapeutic task, faux compliance, where they're trying to play the part of good client and they're not actually experiencing, they're just sort of saying the things they think they're meant to. There's like a whole suite of defenses that people use to avoid, it's actually to avoid getting in contact with the anxiety that is generated by this very difficult feeling, right? And so usually anger is a good example of this. It's not just anger. Um, Ultimately, anger is linked to kind of a guilt, an issue with guilt for quite a lot of people. Also, very deep attachment wound pain that
mm,
comes to the surface eventually. But now I'm going too far ahead. Okay. Um, so, so we could use, so if we're just going to start off by looking at anger, what we're trying to do in the room is slow it down enough that they see that um, they are not, in fact, this is, I'm being very general, but let's be general. They are not, in fact, having an experience of pure anger. This thing that they have labeled over and over throughout like their
yeah.
life, what they talk about is feeling anger currently. This is most people. It's not common to meet someone who has a really healthy relationship to anger, in my experience. Um, that this thing that they've called anger is not actually the full experience of the anger, and it can be different things. But let's just stick with one kind of example. In this example, it would be a fusion with anxiety. It's a really horrible kind of squeezing feeling in the body. It can feel panicky and rushing, and that they act from that place in all sorts of automatic ways. And the manner in which they act from that place is the thing that actually gives rise to their suffering and symptoms in life. For example, um, I can't find a long-term committed relationship. Every time I do, it gets to some point, and if we really trace it back, what happens is that once they get close enough to a person that they start to get into, conflict and disagreement, which is normal and healthy, they can't tolerate this anxious, fused anger that comes up inside them, and it leads them to act in all sorts of disconnecting ways in the relationship. So we want to try and show them that, first of all, what you're talking about, which is why I go on and on about it, what you're talking about is anger is not really just anger. there is a somatic pathway to anger that is different to what you're describing, which sounds like the somatic pathway of anxiety. Part of what Davenlu mapped out, who's the person who created ISTDP, part of what he mapped out in the body is that the pathway of a striated anxiety, which is like the anxiety we're probably almost familiar with, the pathway of that is kind of the opposite of anger. So anger wants to come up, and anxiety is kind of in the same pathway and pushes it down. So anxiety actually has a really tight repressive quality to it, and it works to prevent the anger from being expressed in the body. So this is also really somatic, right? Way of thinking about, or way of working with feelings, I should say. We really focus on the body and notice it, and I'll tell you why. It's not just the sensation, it's that once you really connect into the full sensation, you become much more alive to the impulse. So again, if we stick with anger as the example, what you often find is that once we sit there and point this out, and kind of there's a way of doing it, but this sort of series of pressure and challenge to really look at the feeling and to allow this anger feeling to displace the anxiety that's trying to squeeze it down. Once that finally happens, people come to realize that, oh, this feeling's like going into my hands. My forearms feel very like they want to be very active. My feet feel like they want to stomp on something. My jaw feels like it wants to rip something apart. Like they notice all these, my hands feel like they could break someone's neck. They notice all these things that come with anger that are very, very powerful, obviously have an aggressive impulse. But when it's displaced the anxiety, this is the key part, because this all sounds quite confronting. Once it's displaced the anxiety, people can just notice that. They're not sort of scared. They're not sitting there going, oh, and I'm going to lose my mind and I'm going to do it. They actually have more control because all the anxiety is displaced. It's pushed out by the anger. The anger goes that way, and it pushes out. You're no longer activated anxiously. You're just looking at this thing. It's kind of like just paying attention to your hunger signals. Like just really like it's kind of mindful, I guess, in that sense. You just pay attention to it. You notice the power. Again, lots of generalizing here because there's different forms of presentation, but you might come to notice the power of it. You notice it has a heat to it. Through getting in touch with the impulse is the really key component that Davenlu honed in on, and which I've not really seen in any other school of psychoanalysis or any other form of therapy that I've come across. That seems to be the key here, because the idea anyway, is that when I say what makes us so anxious about our anger, is often what makes us so anxious about our anger is to completely confront the impulse that comes with it. It's to notice that actually what the impulse that comes with the anger might be to, stab a person to death. Right? And I say it's like, this is not normal stuff that you talk about, right? Like you don't look at your partner in an argument and say, wow, I really noticed, the anger in my hands would want to pick up that chopping board and like beat you over the head. Like, this is not a normal kind of way we talk about anger. And yet, if someone really looked and could actually see that within themselves, right, in a particular way, this is kind of like doing it in a controlled environment first, right? But if they can really look and notice that, there's a real relief to that in the moment. And there's a calmness. It's like, just to notice inside me, that's what that animal part of me would want to do right now. I'm obviously not going to do that because I love this person. I'm a moral, socialized being, right? But in the being able to let yourself really see it to its full extent, there's no anxiety. You're not anxious. It's like the difference between, I know I heard in one of your podcasts that I was listening to, that you used to have social anxiety. Right. So it's like the difference between experiencing social anxiety when you're talking to someone versus no longer having that anxiety. Right. Like it's a relief, and you can just notice, wow, that's crazy that there's this like animal inside me that, is like it can really be like that. So you are working to give the client an experience of that in a particular way. That allows them to have enough experience of that with you that it decouples the anxiety from the anger. So it's a little bit like an exposure therapy, right? Principle. You're exposing them to the full impulse so that they come to see that actually, in getting as clear as I can about that, I am less anxious, I am less impulsive, I feel less likely to lose control. It's when this horrible anxiety that just comes online without me feeling like I have any say over it is crushing this feeling down. That's when I feel edgy. That's when I feel like I could actually pick something up and just whack something with it. Like
Mm.
that's when I don't feel myself, and I don't feel like I have as much
Yeah.
connection to my true will and full, you know. So we're trying to teach them that. So there's that component, and I'll let you jump in a sec. I know I've been talking for a while.
Hmm.
But there's a
No,
second
great.
component. Oh, good. There's a second component that I don't get to talk about as much. That's really, really key, but it's not so straightforward to talk about. But there's also something that happens in this process that's not just exposure therapy. It's actually like a doorway. So it's a doorway into the unconscious. This is a
Hmm.
way to access the unconscious, and Devon Liu found this. So we can access the unconscious, but we need to do it through experiential, emotion focused work. It's not through lots of reasoning and thinking with language and philosophy, and like this is a separate set of stuff that we actually need to stop and let the feelings and the pathway of the feelings and exploring the impulse to its fullest extent in our mind's eye, not in real life. The client doesn't actually pick stuff up and do anything and smash it around. It's all just talking about it and letting it play out, sort of the impulse in their body. What would it want to do? Sort of watching the movie play in their mind. Doing that allows people, again, when it's done in a particular fashion, and I think the container of the therapeutic relationship is really key here. Um, but within that container, after certain conditions are met, um, there's this link that gets made. So following the impulse to its fullest extent can lead to people having this breakthrough of emotional experience that's no longer the anger now. Now the guilt comes online, or now the grief comes up, or the pain of, that as a 2-year-old got shoved down and you never ever touched again just comes
Hmm.
out. Like it just comes out. It just comes over the person. And it's a release. And they finally get to have the experience of these other feelings that have also been repressed underneath, right? Because there's kind of like the top of it, and then there's all this other stuff that sits on
Yes.
top of. So it's about allowing that to come up, the processing, the actual processing, which I know is an overused term, but there really is a processing. It's just allowing it to come up, be expressed as it's meant to be. Provide whatever vital information that provides to a person, like feelings come with information. But then also, what often comes with that is links to memory, like just spontaneous. It's not necessarily always things that people haven't remembered before, but all of a sudden, they're just really aware of a particular memory. They're like, oh, I'm thinking about that time I was 5, and it's just very clear in that moment, though. They make a clear link themselves to, oh, that was where I learned that this and that and this about my anger. And actually, I think ever since then I've just never let myself really see it again. And instead I've played the part of
Hmm.
good girl, or I've been a workaholic, like a perfectionist, or whatever it is, right? They start to make these very important links. They get to understand their history, their past life experience in a new way, and they lead a lot of the process. Like you still, as a therapist, are coming in, like, suggesting things, helping them follow certain threads. Um, if we put it in really simple terms, for some people, what happens is they have an experience where once they fully follow the impulse that they have been battling, their psyche has been battling their whole life to never let them follow and see consciously. Once they finally do in the therapy relationship, they might come to see that, oh, this, my partner who I'm like beating to death in this kind of like imaginal impulse, it's not my husband, it's my father. Like they really just like see it in the moment. And then all the trapped feelings about their father that they might have had when they were 2 or whatever, all of that just comes up. And
Yeah.
it's really unlike anything I've ever seen in any other form of therapy. And I worked in different trauma models. I did parts work with dissociation, and I've seen big emotional responses. But there's something to the quality of this. It just feels um, so young, and so like it just comes up and it just overtakes the
Yeah.
person. And on the other side of it, they look different. Like they just look like they passed something that they were supposed to, it was supposed to have passed a long time ago. And they have this new way of being in the world, and they're freed up. And they, so it's two things. It's the being freed up from the crippling anxiety that is there to displace feelings, all the other defense mechanisms as well, because now there's no need to get small and whiny and weepy every time I notice a little signal of anger inside, because that's another way we defend from it. I no longer have to ghost people or disconnect straight away. I no longer get depressed. I no longer get a whole lot of somatic symptoms. So I no longer get crippling stomach aches and like have to run to the toilet all the time when I find myself in conflict or don't know what to do in a situation. All these things clear up because you take a really honest look at the full extent of the impulse that links to particular relevant traumatic events of a past that you get to wrap new meaning around. The meaning making is important on the other side of it. So there's the emotional pass, and then there is the meaning making on the other side. So I don't want this to just sound like it's just, because I think that's the bit that
Yeah.
some modes like miss, or things like breath work might miss. Like it's not just the passing of this stuff and then going, oh, good, something happened. I don't know what, but I feel better. It is really important to do the meaning making because that's how you come to then understand relationships in a new way in the future.
Yeah.
There'll be stuff there that I missed, but I've been talking a long time, so I'm keen to hear.
No, that's great. That's great. Yeah. There's so much there that I love. I think the idea of anger just being kind of the first and often loudest presenting layer of a much deeper, complex, kind of like crust to core
Yes.
kind of progression that often in my experience underneath anger is disappointment, um, uh, neglect, rejection, shame, guilt, all these emotions. And, I think anger, like these kind of violent bouts of anger, I think are actually quite easy for a lot of people to express because, oftentimes it just kind of overcomes someone and it's so powerful. Um, but in the loud, yelling, finger wagging, breaking of things, um, there's there's not a meeting of the other person and like a real slowing down. And I think that's like the slowing down allows someone to be like, oh, like I feel like I feel really hurt right now. And I feel really distant from you. Um I feel like you broke my trust. I like
Mhm.
and that is the real kind of work of parsing through anger. So I really like that idea that there's there's like the allowance of anger because a lot of people can't even allow themselves to express that. But I think why it's such a challenging, confusing, difficult emotion is because it's such a loaded emotion. Like it never is just anger. There's always other
Yes.
things there.
And it's often
Yeah.
squeezed out just quickly, and I'll give it back to you, but
Hmm.
it's often squeezed out like this impulsive kind of anger we're talking about, where we're lashing out and saying really hurtful things. We might actually even be throwing stuff around or whatever it is. It's like a compromise position. It's not, again, that is not the same as when we stop and look at the full impulse that is associated with the anger, right? The full impulse associated with the anger is likely to be something 100 times worse than what you're actually doing. Like it, but the idea is not that you would go and do that, obviously, but to look at that allows us to no longer be so scared of it. Our nervous system's not scared of it anymore. We don't get anxious. So one way of thinking about feelings is they come up and then as they get elicited, and then as they arise into consciousness, as we become aware of them and start to notice them consciously, this is when that threat detection goes off. This is when the anxiety floods us. It's like, oh no, not this one. This one's bad. And so it still keeps coming up for many people. We still become aware we're angry, but it's all mixed up. We're angry, but we're very anxious and tightly wound and impulsive. And it's exactly like you say, that is the disconnecting quality, is that we're going too fast, we're acting impulsively. Um, and the thing that usually comes out, like the yelling and the saying horrible things, or even if it's someone who's throwing stuff around or whatever they're doing, is often this weird, and this is not a judgment, I'm not saying this is right, but it's a weird compromised position of somewhere in our psyche knowing what this anger would really want to do, but we also can't do that because we care about people, and like we might love this person, or we also don't want to go to jail, or like we're just moral. And so it is actually a coming together of that, but it's just being done in a really embattled way. Like it's not, we're not slowing it down and being mindful to it. And we can't be, because the anxiety is going off. It's like the anxiety signal is just firing. For some people, that's like dissociation. It's a really high level of anxiety. They dissociate when they get angry. They black out. And, for some people, it's the crippling gut. Like there's a whole pathway of anxiety that goes into our gut. And there's all sorts of physical physical components to this as well, of suffering. But it's actually going one step further and noticing that these things that we might do if we feel like we lose control are probably not the full extent of the impulse, and to really allow oneself to see that and feel the power of it in our body, and notice that doesn't lead us to do it. But again, you have to actually have experience with that, because it's very counterintuitive. People are like, yeah, no, but when I feel angry, I lose control. I don't want to look at it more. Like I don't want to continue to look at that impulse. That is frightening, Yeah. And for some people, there's obviously special work you need to do around that, because it can be a bit more complicated. But if we're just talking in generalities, there's a manner in which in the therapy room we provide that experience over time that allows someone to learn that they actually gain more control when they're able to see it more fully.
Mm-hmm.
That helps.
Yeah. Yeah, I want to pick up on that. I worked with a somatic therapist once, and after I had identified where my body, the emotion that I was feeling was, he told me to make it bigger.
Mm.
And like what he was doing, which I immediately kind of shuddered in fear around. I
Yeah.
was like, you want me to do what?
Yeah.
Was he understood that, and he says this, like all feelings have a beginning, middle, and end. And often we try and play whack-a-mole, like before the emotion even begins. We try and smash it underneath the ground. And if you just allow it to expand like a balloon, like there's going to come a point where there's enough helium in the balloon where it's just gonna pop, and it's gonna go away. And it's like it's this paradoxical thing, is like if you expand the thing you're scared of, it becomes less scary. And that I think is exactly what you're kind of pointing to, which is allowing the experience to happen in its entirety, and be present for it all.
Mm-hmm.
And then on the other end, yeah, it's like, and then I think that's where the kind of meaning making comes in, where you begin to realize like all of the instances of your life that you make decisions based on an avoidance or a control of uncomfortable emotions. And it's like,
Mm-hmm.
once you kind of notice that, and you start to, when those uncomfortable emotions arise, instead of doing those behaviors, sit with it. Like there's a new host of options on the other side of that. Um and and it's and it's really exciting. Like it's
Yeah.
exciting. I see people who kind of go through that process of like, wow, like this job that I thought that I had to be in, this relationship that I thought that I had to be in, this uh geographic location that I thought I was bound to, like those are just constructs of my mind that are like protecting me from, and I think now I'm kind of more talking about fear maybe than anger. But I think they're connected.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I agree with you. And I think it's the freeing up of agency is kind of how I talk about it. Seeing
Yeah.
people come alive, exactly like you're saying, to all of a sudden they can just make decisions they can take action in the world in a new, more liberated way. It's not as agonized and anxious, again, like opening their eyes to, well, actually I can be more flexible, I can try things out, I'll try doing it like this. So and there's a real joy you see come for people when they're able to do that, to be able to act in the world with some sense of um, like it's coming from them. I think this is maybe too what I've been getting at. I won't go too far afield, but when I've been talking a little about this idea of authentic resonance in recent times too, there's something new that we are able to more clearly connect into on the other side of doing this. That is no longer we are no longer just mostly being driven by an unconscious desire to avoid painful emotional states that are related to early life wounds that kind of got blocked and left there, right? And so we're never able to process and have their start and middle and end. We are instead being driven by this programming inside us, even if we're not aware of it, to avoid all situations that kind of evoke that in us. And there's all sorts of magnificent ways that our mind can do that. Um, and so once some of that is lifted, oh, then we get to make decisions based on other things too. And then we're much more able to connect into, yeah, like what really lights me up? What do I feel really drawn to? What is truly meaningful to me? How do I really want to connect with this person here right now as they are in this moment with me here, and not as some kind of version of my dad or my mum or something that I've like applied over them, or some past relationship. They are a brand new person in front of me in this moment. I can meet them afresh right now, right here. And that's actually really exciting that we get to do that, as opposed to scary, anticipating they're going to respond in certain ways, my nervous system being on edge and ready for them to do X, Y, and Z. It's liberating. It's truly liberating. And you'll still have pain. Of course you will. Like life is full of
Yeah, of course.
painful.
Yeah.
Um, was there more you wanted to say though? I did jump in there.
Yeah, well, I'm kind of feeling drawn to sharing a little bit about my
Yeah.
own personal life and kind of where I'm coming from with specifically anger, but I think just
Yeah.
healing and therapy in general. Um, so I'm always a little hesitant to do this because it's like I don't want to like hijack the conversation and
No,
just
no,
like
no, no. I would
spill
love
out
to
like a
hear
book
this.
of
No, I mean, I would
okay,
love to.
great.
This is what drew me to reach out.
Yeah,
Anyways, I just would love
yeah,
to get to know you as a person. So
yeah,
please.
fantastic. Okay. So I'm the son of two immigrants from South Africa. Australia is not too terribly far
Mhm.
from where my parents grew up. So my parents met in college. And my dad can get into more, but he's always been this person who's had grand visions for his life and uh, his children. And he always knew that he wanted to have a family, and he always knew that South Africa was not the place that he wanted to do that. Like my parents emigrated to the U.S. 3 years after apartheid ended, and they grew up during apartheid, and South Africa was just a very crime-ridden place, very unstable place, very unsafe for you know for pretty much everybody. So they met. My dad was first an engineer, then he transitioned to patent law, intellectual property law, and he ended up getting a job in the Bay Area, Silicon Valley, kind of at the dot-com bubble
Mhm.
era. And my parents moved, and yeah, I was born 2 years after that. And
Did you have any siblings?
my yeah, I have a younger sister. She's 18 months younger than me. And my childhood was um it was interesting because my dad um was always a very controlling parent. And it, like was just the type of parent that like had just this very concretized idea of like how children and genderized too, how boys should behave and how girls should behave. And before I was born, like he was like, if I have a firstborn son, I'm gonna name him after my dad, and he's gonna like be a golfer. Like that was his idea. And so, at 3 years old, I had a plastic golf club in my hand. I was whacking plastic golf balls around in the backyard. Uh yeah, I started playing tournaments when I was 7. By 11, I was playing internationally.
Wow.
Like very, like in the summer, it was like 5, 6 times a week. We were traveling to tournaments. He was driving me all across the state. Like it was very, yeah, it was like very involved. And like,
Mm.
some of the people that I was playing with are now playing professionally um, and all the rest. But there was this real like discord between how I felt and acted at school and how I was at home. Like at
Mm.
school, there was this freedom, there was this expressiveness. I was always this very emotionally sensitive, like, I was athletic, I was good at sports, but I knew there was like the cool popular boys were like not my crowd. And like I was like, in middle school, I was in a friend group of all Mormon kids because I think I just gravitated towards the wholesomeness of like
Yeah.
of that. And I effortlessly made friends with girls and boys. And like um I think school for the most part up until like kind of the end of middle school was like a very joyful time. Um but my home life was like riddled with anxiety and paranoia like all the time. There was this like fear of transgressing. Like my dad had me on this like very strict workout plan. Like I was like working out and running like 6, 7 times a week, and like from the age of like 9, 10. And it was kind of this very like drill sergeant, like you do this, and if you don't accomplish it, like I'm gonna make you feel bad about yourself, like that kind of attitude. And my my parents ended up getting divorced when I was 13, and there was this uh there was physical abuse, there was emotional abuse, um there
Mm.
was a restraining order. My dad didn't see us for 6 months. There was this years long custody battle. um and a psychiatrist ended up evaluating him and identified that he had borderline personality disorder and narcissistic personality disorder. Um, and at the time, I didn't really know what that meant,
Yeah.
but um, it started to contextualize like what was going on and like what I was feeling. Because up until that point, there was really no one in my life who was communicating to me that what I was going through was not healthy and was not right. I mean, some of my friends would come over and interact with my dad and like kind of pick up weird vibes and like say things to me, but there was never like this is like abusive and like unhealthy.
Yeah.
Um, and I ended up staying in relationship with him, primarily just out of fear of like how he would react if I were to, cut him off. So fast forward to college, I'm in my sophomore year, and I decide to be an orientation leader for my school's like orientation week. And so I'm tasked with one other person like leading 15 freshmen around campus and doing activities with them, touring the campus, just making them feel like their entrance into university is like a positive one. And it was a really intense week. Like we had to wake up at like 6 in the morning, planning the whole day, being alive and animated for these people. And I felt this like anxiety this whole time of like, this kind of imposter syndrome feeling of like, I'm barely older than these kids, and I'm, now supposed to be this like mature, like,
Wise guys.
centered, wise guy, like giving them all this, advice. And like, I just feel like I just got here.
Mm,
And I was walking back to my dorm. We had like a lunch break, and I had my first panic attack.
yeah.
And luckily I haven't had one since, but I had to sit down on this bench, and like my body was shaking. My head was like, felt like it was like put in a furnace. It was like
Yeah.
overheating, and like my face was like vibrating, and I was just crying. Like I was just like sobbing uncontrollably. And it was just all these thoughts of like, you're not enough, you're not good enough, you don't know what you're doing. Like they just kind of all like precipitated up and just boiled over. And after that, I didn't say anything. Like I didn't say anything to my partner, my co-leader. I didn't say anything to the people in my group. I just I just felt like there was no space for that. And it was kind of ironic because we were facilitating all these like conversations for our group around you know, like things like psychological safety, and like, we were doing a lot of like
Hmm.
sexual assault awareness stuff, like just like,
Hmm.
things that just open dialogues about different things. And I was not doing that for myself. And I didn't know how to do that for myself. And I think more importantly, I felt like I didn't have the right to do that for myself. Like that was what was ingrained in me and from a very young age. And so I ended up going, starting therapy soon after that. And, I just found lightning in a bottle. Like I'm still seeing my same therapist today.
Yeah.
And he works in the ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy world. And
Yeah. It's a great modality.
interestingly, fantastic, fantastic. And interestingly, like anger was one of the first things that really came up. And I mean, the first two sessions, I don't really think I said many things because I was crying the whole, like, just the whole time. Um, but it started to like these years and years of like mistreatment and being made to feel small and deficient and not good enough and too
Mm.
emotional and too much like my mom, and all these things like that I had, in order to survive, in order to
Yeah.
um, continue being in relationship with my dad, I suppressed and sacrificed, just annihilated myself essentially.
Yes.
Um, were allowed to like surface.
Yeah.
And I realized like, oh wow, like I never allowed myself to be a person. Like, and I had this story of like the my function as a person is to be anything and everything for everyone else. Um, and and it was in that moment that like it started this journey of Bowen talks about differentiation of self. Like it started then. Um, and I remember very early on, like I I actually I think he kind of characterized me as much more of an anxious attachment person, and a fawner, which is certainly true. But I actually became quite avoidant early on because I noticed for the first time that I had needs,
Yeah.
and I started to distance myself from people who I felt like weren't recognizing that, to a point where I was kind of like isolating myself.
Yeah.
And so I remember like one session he drew this kind of seesaw of like, there's this spectrum of, from codependence to narcissism. And like until you kind of have this healthy ego structure, there's this like wild oscillation that can happen between the two of like, oh shoot, I'm becoming too codependent. So now I gotta isolate, and now I gotta like prioritize myself.
Yeah.
And then,
Yes.
oh shoot, like I'm kind of feeling shameful about that. So like, let me go back in relationship. And it's like, and it's, it's that wild oscillation. And I mean, it took me years to, I think, start to strike a
Mm,
healthy balance between those two, between autonomy and togetherness, as Bowen also talks about. Um, and so, I've come to the place now, in the beginning that I shared about anger, being underpinned by care is like I I think without the identification of that anger, I wouldn't have drafted a letter to my dad saying, I don't think this is going to work out. And it just the trajectory that my life is on now, where I am pursuing a career that I want instead of a career that I feel like would make him happy. Um, I think is like all tied back, right? It's like all tied back to that anger, but
mm,
it was held in a container with a person, principally my therapist, and now fortunately a lot of other people who like
mm,
know that at my core, I'm a person who wants to help people and a person who cares and who has an empathetic heart
mm.
and is not going to get corrupted by my anger. I
Yes.
want to pass it back to you, but I was just playing with an example today of like, when Hitler was in prison writing Mein Kampf, like he was angry at the way Germany was treated after World War One, like the way they got the raw end of the deal of, like the treaty accords and, like obviously what manifested out of that, no sane person is going to agree with.
Yeah.
So like, what's the difference between like his experience of anger, which I mean, in some senses, is probably justified, and the way like what he chose to focus on and how he chose to channel it, which was hateful and every ism in the book. Um, and, you know, someone like myself and countless other people that I've encountered who go through terrible, terrible things. And I'm fortunate that the terrible things that happened to me were on like a familial scale. I mean, some people go, it's a societal scale, it's structural racism or it's whatever it might be. Um, and come out of it and like lead with beauty and lead with
Yeah.
kindness and lead with forgiveness
Mhm,
while still not um, justifying and condoning what has
mhm.
happened to them. Like
Yeah.
that seems like kind of the rub
Yeah.
of anger,
Yeah.
and what's so difficult to
Yeah.
do.
I know.
But yeah, thank you for giving me the space to do that, to share a little bit more about myself, and I'm open to um, you know, I think I'm very privileged and I'm very blessed in a lot of ways. And what I endured, I see now. I was just talking to my aunt just before this, and um, she was like, everything that's happened to you is the Lord showing you like how to love. Um, and it was just really beautiful to hear her say that. And so I'm very open
Yeah.
now to talking about it all.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. Um, what an incredible way that you have been able to make sense of that and channel that and really come out the other side of it. I mean that truly, like an incredible, it's an incredible spirit
Appreciate
to be
that.
able to do that.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm so sorry that those things happened to you.
Yeah.
Um, there's a few different points. One thing I did want to say that stuck out to me as you were telling me the how it went for you, um, is I wondered too about the panic attack that you experienced.
Hmm.
that it seems like it came off the back of you sort of being, you were in a role there that was like an authority role. You were in that, you're almost in that
Yeah.
sort of like fatherly role. You're taking a position there of being the
Yeah.
person to guide, and the conflict that would bring up inside for you based on the template of the father you had. And that you, it sounds to me like what you're saying is that you would never have been allowed to have, you would never have been allowed to take that kind of role on, right, with your father. Like, it was important that your psyche found ways for you to redirect any signal inside that would make you want to stand upright and be very clear about your preference, right? That is not an option in that relationship. From a survival point of view, it sounds like. Um, and so I'm glad you were able to find a therapist, and I'm glad that you've found acceptance and commitment therapy to be so useful. It's the modality that I was most recently working in before I found ISTDP, that
Hmm.
I pivoted to ACT after a whole series of other stuff, because I loved that the focus was on how we relate to our inner experience. It's no longer
Yeah.
about trying to change the inner experience, like, let's test this out. It was just, we can form a different relationship to these things that will happen inside us. And then it gives you a very clear, I like the values work. It gives you something very clear and tangible to hold on to about,
Yeah.
now what? Now I've related differently now.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so I definitely relate.
Which so many therapies miss or
Yes,
just don't include, which is what you had mentioned previously. Um,
yes,
and that I've always kind of found CBT kind of like a turnoff for because of that. It's kind of like, well, if you're feeling a bad feeling, it's because you're having the wrong thought. And
that's
let's
right.
just like surgically remove that one and put a new one in. And it's like, and this kind of goes to the conversation you sent me on voicecraft that you did, and there was a section there where there was a discussion around um like therapists not being the authority, and Cadell said something really insightful.
Yeah.
Is it okay if I
Of
like
course. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Of course you
share?
can.
Okay, yeah. Where he was like the therapist doesn't know and the client does know.
Yeah,
And I feel like CBT comes with the assumption that the therapist knows and the client doesn't know. And that's always been kind of a turnoff for me. But so I really love, yeah, I really love with ACT that it's like helping the client to identify or re-remember what their own values are for
that's right.
themselves. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, yeah. No, I agree with you. I was so frustrated with not being able to do anything with the next step. And I find with CBT too, it has a place. I do really think it has a place. But in a general
Yeah, I
sense, I
agree.
don't find it useful for people, because you are kind of teaching them that they need to get in there and curate their inner life. Like, here's some special little thing you can do and just change the manner of your thoughts. It's actually teaching them to avoid more and to be even more controlling with themselves, and to not.
Yes. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, but therapists like it because it's very, then it doesn't make a therapist anxious. It's a very clear protocol, and so much of this is about how do therapists manage their own anxiety in the room. Are they
Right.
willing to do the thing that makes them very uncomfortable? And that, I mean, I had to come face to face with that with ISTDP. What ultimately happened was I found that even after using ACT for a while, I just found myself avoiding lots of things. Like, I would avoid
Mm.
certain things with certain clients. And then I noticed that they were really probably, I had a sense they're probably really avoiding telling me something there, but would just move along. There was just all this avoidance. And
Hmm.
ISTP was a way for me to learn how to be more confrontational in a loving way, from a loving position, with it, with, an attempt to try to get to the heart of matters and to not waste time with the client. Um,
Yeah.
I'll park that for 1 second.
That's interesting.
Yeah, yeah.
And and I yeah and j just to say one thing, I have actually sensed that in my own therapy that like
Mm,
there's times when I know that I'm kind of like bullshitting myself, and I wish that my therapist would
yeah,
point that out. And I feel like the maybe one potential weakness of ACT is it kind of has this underlying assumption that like all manifestations of thought and feeling are not acceptable but like understandable.
yeah,
And so like there's a lot of validation and there's a lot of contextualization of why you're feeling the way you're feeling, which is extremely valuable and like,
Mhm.
I mean, saves lives.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, it
but
does.
I think I think the weakness of it might be like there is kind of an aversion to kind of pointing out like an incongruency or an
Yes,
inconsistency.
because there's
Um,
yep, no go.
yeah, no, go ahead, go
Well,
ahead.
because yes, because what happens is that there's a series of ways that even our feelings can be defensive of something deeper.
Hmm.
So I
Hmm.
find sometimes with ACT, like you say, yeah, it's a bit like good, like that's there's not enough pressure to sort of like push something aside if you are on the track of really trying to look at something in particular. There's kind of this like being able to sweep things aside and suggest to the client that if we go down that path now, we're not going to get where we're going today. Like, okay, well, like, I wonder if that comes up to cloud out what might sit deeper than that. Let's just put that to one side and attempt to see what happens. It's got more of a kind of focus to it in that manner and a premise, I guess. There's this principle that the client sitting in front of you is not going to be able to report to you everything that is going on for them that might be relevant. Like there's an unconscious at play. And so you are not just taking them at their word when they're reporting things, you are also looking to their body for clues, what they're doing right now. There's an incongruency when you say that you feel nothing, but I see your hands squeeze like claws, or, you're listening for multiple things at once. It's not just what the person's able to report, and you might be able to, with just a little bit of precision and nudging, help the client to see, oh yeah, I think actually I'm bullshitting myself when I say it. Actually, maybe maybe it's not that. Maybe I'm actually not angry at that person. Maybe I feel guilty. Like, maybe I'm so there is a manner in which there is more confrontation and pressure from the therapist, but done in a particular way, and always with the
Hmm.
client's consent. It's more active. It's much more active from the therapist, but
Yeah,
it means that the therapist needs to be much more comfortable with their own anxiety, because it's a lot to sit there
yeah.
and it's from a place of compassion, but it's not this always being soft and warm and just open to what is. It's a compassion that is going to point out, I think this is the thing that you're doing that is leading to all the suffering. Like if we sit here now for the next 40 minutes and you sit in these weepy tears, that's what you do everywhere else. I don't know that's gonna help you in any way here. I don't know that that's
Hmm.
giving you the best experience of what we could be doing here. Maybe this is a problem. Maybe the fact that every time someone um, lets you down, that you fall into this hopeless, passive, small puddle of tears. Maybe that's part of the problem here. Can we look at that? You don't just accept it for what it is and go, good, have a cry, make space for it. How does it feel? Because there's different kinds of crying. And there is the crying that
Yeah.
is aggressive and helpless. And then there is the crying that is in being in touch with a true pain that you've been pushing away for a long time. And it's a process. And on the other side, you feel different. Do you know what I
Hmm.
mean? So there's
Yes, yeah.
yeah. So there's lots of
It's a transformative emotion. Um, so
yes,
I'm curious how you approach that confrontation in the therapy room. Like,
yeah.
obviously, I'm not asking you to disclose confidential information about a client, but like
Hmm.
how, I mean, I'm asking this for just out of curiosity for how you work, but also just in my own life, I notice that's a struggle for myself when I'm in relationship with someone that I feel like is doing something um that is self-destructive. And
Yeah.
you know how I had been socialized growing up is like um I didn't have there wasn't a place for me. Like, I didn't ever feel like I had legitimacy to do that. And then there's also this kind of allergy to how my father did it, which is like in a very demeaning, patronizing way. Um, so I'm curious how you approach from a loving stance,
Mhm.
um, this kind of like opening someone up to what they're not seeing, which is kind of what it sounds like
Yeah.
is happening.
Yeah. It's really painting a picture of the pieces for them to help them see that what you are doing here and now in this very moment with me in the room is potentially another example of that thing that you came in with and you're telling me about happens with your partner, and that thing that happened last week when you were at work, and that problem that we had 2 months ago when there was some scheduling issue, and then there was this response similar to this. There's a pattern here, right? And
Yeah.
I don't, and I point this out. You tell them, you're very declarative, right? Like, I point this out to you, right? Because I don't know that you're seeing it. And maybe I'm wrong, right? Maybe what I point out to you, you disagree with, and you're welcome to. But it wouldn't be right for me to sit here, take your money, right? Be here on this therapeutic journey with you, and just nod along when I feel like I'm seeing something here that might be relevant to the struggle that you brought in, right? I think it's important we really look at this rather than just accept it at face value as a feeling, right? Or as a whatever, right? Because if it's so, like, we use hopelessness as one, or like that sort of going passive. If it's true,
Yeah.
if it's true right now that that you are powerless, right? You are powerless, and the only way to deal with it is to go small, to collapse into a puddle of tears, and that's going to last for the next 40 minutes. Then it seems like we're not going to get anywhere. Like actually, sometimes really pointing that out to a person. It's trying to you're trying to raise the conflict inside them. So
Mm-hmm. Mm.
because and this is what I mean about it is from a loving place, and it doesn't mean that it's always experienced that way. I should say, like, there's a real learning curve here of trying to figure out the exact presentation of a person, and really trying to match your style in a way that confronts them in the needed way, but is also trying to do it in a way that sends them the signal of love and care so that they take it on board. They don't just reject you. But there's a lot of going back and forth with that. And you can get it wrong. You can get it wrong with one client, and then point that out and work on it to get it right next time. But in my mind, just based on my history of doing therapy with people, I would much rather take that risk and that gamble. I'd much rather try and really be there to give the person the full experience of what they are looking for, to really truly get to the heart of their suffering, than to do the safer move, which I get and has a place, but the safer move of, well, it's not really my place to suggest that, or it's just being open. I don't think it's just about being open and allowing someone to just have whatever is there with them in the moment. I think if you have a clear goal, which is that I notice that I get into this pattern in relationships where yeah, like I can only get so close to someone. Like all my romantic relationships always end at 2 years. I have no idea why. Like, what is going on? Like something, then that is our focus, and we're really trying to be focused on that. And now I'm not being focused, but it's about like just really I have to hold on to the idea, I guess, inside myself that my job is not to always be nice. It's not to always
Yeah.
smile and be warm and pleasing to the other. And based on my relational history, that's quite different, because that was like a role that I would play, and that's how I would keep people at enough of an arm's length. I would be very smiley and very people pleasing, and then people never really got to get close to me as well. But that's an aside. And so I've had to let go of some of that. I don't want to bring that into the therapy room. I can still be loving by just being open and available to them and truly attuned. There is something about true attunement that even if you're pointing this out to someone, and they might have a moment's resistance, it's like unconsciously it lands somewhere, and they often respond in quite a grateful way. Like, you imagine if your therapist finally pointed out to you, like at some point, I don't know if this is a real feeling, or maybe there's more there. Maybe this is something that's just covering things. Like, you finally feel, oh, there's a recognition that you've actually been more deeply attuned to. And it comes from somewhere unconsciously. But that's what we call the unconscious therapeutic alliance. So you're working to build that underneath all the time as well. You're trying to give the client the experience that you're in their corner, but you need to do that by not just being a whatever happens is okay. The signal you do give them is that it's okay, in the sense that I'm not gonna end the relationship. Like, I'm not going to reject you. Obviously, the scenarios where, but in a broad sense, we can stay here. Like, you might still choose to come here and spend every session going into weepy tears for 40 minutes. That's okay. That's your right. Like, you respect their autonomy. That's your right. I just want to make this conscious. I want us to be able to talk about what might be happening here. And then you get to choose. You get to choose what's right for you. And I'll still be here, and we can still do this. but I want to be honest that I'm wondering if this is actually a cover for us getting to the next step. I
Hmm.
wonder if this is just another
Yeah.
bit of what happens when you get to
Yeah.
the year mark with so and so, or like what used to happen with your dad, or right. And then it's an invitation. It's an invitation to the person to see it in a new way, and to then, if they want to, make the decision to do something different. And then you can kind of do more of a pressure to, well, what sits underneath it if we don't do that? If we just put that to one side, let's look at what happened. And this does link to when you were sharing your story of your life. Um, One way, again, I know scant details, so it's just in a general sense, but one way that something, ISTDP might conceptualize what you're talking about there in relation to anger is that what happened for you, I imagine, very, very early on, before you were even aware of it at all, was that somewhere in your psyche, it learned that, even if we just stick with you and your dad and put your mum to one side, you learned that in relationship with an authority figure, or a male, or however it coded it, right? Um, it is very, very dangerous that I ever become aware of feeling anger towards them, right? That's not going to happen, because that's going to be a real problem here, too, right? And so instead, it gets kind of siphoned off and put to one side. And it sounds like for you, that probably turned into self-attack. So it gets redirected. So this is something that's really
Yep.
important about anger, is it has a very clear direction. So when people say I'm angry at
Yes.
the world, or I'm just angry at the situation, um, that's vague. So ISTDP would be like, well, that's vague. That tells me nothing about who you're angry at. So if we look at the situation again, this happened, this person said that, and then you notice feeling anger at the world, like you try and help them see that there's actually a clear target to the anger. And why is it that they're unable to notice that? What's so threatening about noticing the target of the anger? So that's where the anxiety comes in. It's when, so
Mm,
this person can notice
yeah.
anger, but they're unable to notice it where it's actually directed. And often that leads to self-attack. So we put it back on ourselves. So we get angry at ourselves. And this can often be, like you were reporting, that very self-critical voice that we carry in our head that just tries, like you said, like tries to destroy us. It keeps us passive, right? Like when it's going at us and telling us we are worthless, we don't have a right, we are this, we are that, it is like cutting us off at our knees, and it is putting us in that powerless position. It is, you can see how it's functioning to do the thing that you needed to do to stay safe. You should not have been standing up with authority to your father when you were little. That would have been very bad for you. So something in your psyche was able to really smartly redirect that to apply it to yourself, make yourself even more passive. So notice how the anger at yourself actually puts you in the even smaller position, which actually in a roundabout way keeps you safe in the relationship with your dad. Because even though it's
Yes. Yes.
horrendous and abusive, I would say that that is not the full extent of what it would have been if you all of a sudden found your voice and decided to tell him with your nice, bold, assertive tone that, all these ways that he was disappointing and hurting you.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's how we would conceptualize it, is that it works to redirect the impulse. It goes back to the impulse. I mean, I don't
Yeah.
know. I'm not going to, but I would imagine the experience you had, there would be some anger deep down in there towards this person who was abusive to you, that would be very aggressive in nature. No child is sort of able to face that within themselves, especially in the context of an unsupportive family like that. I don't imagine that you could have gone to your dad and said, "Oh, I noticed when I get angry with you, there's this impulse to like stab you in the chest," and like that's not, you're never. So again, it gets redirected. And often what happens when you really dig into it with this form of therapy is you find the link between what you do to yourself is often what the impulse wanted to do to the other, when you really
Mm,
follow it. And this is quite true with
mm,
chronic health conditions, like the physical manifestation of these things. Someone who lives a lifetime with like pounding headaches that sort of have no medical explanation might come to see that the impulse that they repressed forever was actually wanting to bash someone over the head repeatedly. Or someone who has, stabbing pains in their gut might come to find that the impulse was actually to get something sharp and stab someone in the guts. You see, so there's this like one-to-one relationship that often emerges about the impulse and how we then put it on ourselves. And so when I talk about like you sort of cut yourself off at the knees, you go powerless, you assume the small position. It sounds to me like there's like even though inside you, of course, you would have a drive to want to stand up and be an authority sometimes and be a leader, but you would have been taught to never ever do that in the relationship with your dad. So it does
Hmm.
the necessary thing to you to keep you like that. And then, in a roundabout way, when you're in a position trying to lead these students through an orientation and you find yourself in that authority position, this is going to elicit a massive conflict inside you because that old system's going to rear its head and say, this is threatening, dangerous. Don't you ever do this and think that you're able to be some sort of authority or voice or, you know, um, and then there'll be the part of you that I, would imagine is under there, your healthy self. That's like, yeah, like this is what I want to do. This feels good. I'm caring for people, nurturing. So they're in conflict. That creates heaps of anxiety, that conflict. And that massive anxiety was probably the panic attack, like just an eruption
Yeah.
of not knowing what to do, just being in a complete bind.
That's exactly what it was. It was a paralysis.
Yeah.
It was like just a profound sense of
Yeah.
like I'm damned if I do, damned if I don't. And I found myself in that situation many, many times. Like that's just such a prevalent pattern of
Yep.
I'm faced with like having the hard conversation or not, and kind of, combing over it. And it's like I see danger on both sides. And my system was so hyper attuned to um threats of danger. And it was like, and I think the directing the anger back to myself, making myself small, um it then perpetuates the cycle of needing to be subservient to someone else. And so by doing that, I now need my father. And
Yes.
so I never have to face the reality of separating, which is
Yep.
what all of those reactions were trying to avoid, which
Yes.
is being cut off from your parent.
Yes.
Which,
Yes.
like that was so ingrained. And then yeah, it mapped onto all these other authority figures. And I think what this self-flagellation does is it makes yourself small, and so invariably everyone else is put on a pedestal. And so like I saw all my teachers this way, they can do no wrong.
Yeah.
When all my friends were like, oh yeah, that teacher, like, she's kind of bratty, or like she's just not attentive, or she's I could never allow myself to see it.
Mm.
Because
Mhm.
how who was I to say that about my teacher? Like she's doing the best
Well, it
she
would
can, and she's
require you to
teaching us. And
notice. It would require you to notice
yeah,
the bit inside you that goes, I don't like that, what that person's doing. And it's about that person. It's not about me. So it has to notice
right.
the anger signal and that it's directed towards someone else who's an authority. We already know now, like the system was never designed for you to ever have that. So if anything, it would go back on you to start to notice the signal of not liking goes on you, if anything. Probably like, who am I? Like that. Who am I to have any sort of
Yeah,
opinion here? It's that
yeah,
again. You get angry at yourself.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Or um, like maybe that's true about this teacher, but like how can I make the best of it? Like how can I, what can I do to still, that there was always that, which I think in a way
Yeah.
was healthy because it gave me some degree of agency where, I would see a lot of people just be like, oh yeah, this authority figure or the
Mm.
president of the US is so terrible, and like what are we going to do? And you kind of just like
Yeah.
become nihilistic about it. And I don't think I ever, you know, like I have been depressed and I've been very anxious, but I don't think I've ever been nihilistic, because I think there has always been some mechanism in me that always believes that I can do something about a situation. And I think for a long time that was unhealthy, of like, oh, like what can I do to um be better or be enough for this other person? And it was this very unidirectional thing. But
Mm.
I think
Yeah.
um part of what was healthy about the unhealthiness of my childhood was it ingrained in me a certain sense of um like I don't know, some agential thing that I think I've continued to carry through like I'm a very optimistic person, and I feel like I've always been an optimistic person. And it's the I think the continue grow the area that I need to continue to grow into is um having optimism while still staying grounded in
Yeah.
the reality that
Yeah.
um there are complex um complexities to all of us,
Mm-hmm.
and really not being blind to the warts and the flaws of everyone, including myself,
Yes.
and being comfortable holding those mixed, contradictory feelings. Like there's a mentor of one of my therapists who says mental health is the ability to tolerate mixed, contradictory feelings.
Wow.
And yeah,
Yeah.
I really
Who
like
is
that.
that? Because that's the heart of
I,
ISTDP.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I don't remember his name now,
That's
but
right.
I know you were talking about that
Yeah.
on that voice craft conversation, because yeah, that's at the heart of it. And one last thing before I pass it over to
Yeah.
you, like the you're talking about hopelessness,
Mm.
and you know like if you think about like hopelessness, like there's a certain certainty about it. Like
Mhm.
if you're hopeless, it's like I'm hopeless, and that's all I'll ever be
Yeah,
kind of feeling. And
that's right.
and when you were talking about like kind of facilitating someone's movement towards identifying conflict from
Mm.
that place, like you're moving them away. Like
Mhm.
there's a certain comfort in hopelessness,
Yeah, that's right.
because there's a certainty, and
Yeah.
like to make someone aware of like the the conflicting emotions of like, yeah, on one end I feel really small and powerless right now, but on the other end I really want to not feel that way, and I really want to do something about it. And it's like have those two emotions meet, and then have that person hold that. And that seems like
Yeah.
what
Yeah.
that work would help someone to do.
Yes. Because even being able to notice those two things happening inside as opposed to just picking one of them, which is to just fall hopeless, right? Um, that is the start of this. So what I mean by that is that it's often the noticing actually that signal of not liking, which I would call anger, that signal of not liking, noticing that within us and really trying to bring that up and foreground that finally for someone who has a history of never doing that and instead going small and weepy, for example, is the thing that is finally going to override. It's going to be the thing that finally allows the person to go, no, I'm actually going to do something different here. There is actually something deep down I want in this situation, or there is a particular way I feel, or there is an impulse to act. I don't have to fall on myself and kind of do it to myself. It's a rerouting again into oneself when we sort of go into the regressive position. In therapy, it's relevant, that hopelessness, because it becomes a wall. I can never get to my client. There's nothing I can do. Um, Now, obviously, that for someone who's never had an experience of anyone ever allowing enough space to even just sit with that for a minute, like, of course, you would do some of that. I'm not talking about kind of all the groundwork, but ultimately, you get to a point where it's like, well, if we're going to do something here together, right, and transform things for you, I can't get to you when you're in that position. It's like the wall goes up. You've made a decision for yourself, like you said, you've made a decision for yourself that there's no hope here. It's firm. I can't magically change your mind for you. You see how it's got that really childlike regressive wish to it. It's just the like, going small. And the way we would think about it is this is the strategy that the psyche has found um, was the most useful for whatever reason back in past relationships, maybe even in present day ones, but it's not going to help in therapy. So trying to point that out, right? Like when you put your wall up and you go to that position, I actually can't help. I can't get to you. I can sit here and be with you. I'm not going to leave you. I can be here. I can be available. But there has to be some decision inside, right? Some decision inside for something different. So it is a pointing out that it's defensive and that it also keeps the therapist at a distance. Isn't it,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then sometimes too, it's the grappling with noticing that in me pointing that out, that might even start to elicit even more anger inside them, because now what is my therapist doing now they're pointing out something, what, like, this isn't what I wanted from them. I just want them to sit there and be, tell me that I'm a good person or whatever it is. But even that in and of itself is an invitation. Then tell me what's happening for you as I point this out, as I try and make this move to do something different. That I don't want to be a repeat of your mother or your friends or your ex-boyfriend or whoever, right? Who you had to go into this position for the fight to finally finish, or for them to finally, I don't know, come and give you a hug, or for you to finally be left alone and escape the situation of conflict or whatever it was. I don't want to be a repeat of that, right? So like it's the trying to map out the relational dynamic that is relevant to what they are then trying to enact in the room with you, because it's not going to get anywhere. But the heart of all of this, which I think you're getting to, is this idea of complex mixed feelings. So what you're describing about one way for the psyche to deal with a feeling like anger in the context of like an attachment relationship is to split, right? So this is splitting. Do you know about the defense of splitting a little bit? Yeah.
Vaguely, but I think, yeah, I can go
It
into it.
does. It is what it sounds like. So
Yeah,
essentially,
yeah.
rather than notice the complexity, which is I have these two motivations inside me, which come from two different feelings. I am both like have loving, positive, connecting feelings towards this attachment figure. I want to be close to them and connected and cared for by them. But I'm also noticing this intense rage rising within me that might want to cut their head off. Right. Like, so for a child to learn how to be with both of those things without having to choose one over the other, which would be splitting, right? They need to be within a relational context where they're given the space to understand that, have that validated, explored. Obviously, then have the parent help them see that, we can't go around cutting people's heads off. That wouldn't be okay, right? But not be rejecting in that, right? So helping them to notice the difference between their interiority and exteriority, like that, right? So so what splitting essentially is we have to separate these things from one another, because we can't hold the anxiety that comes from the complexity of noticing them both there. That's that paralyzing quality. I have no idea what I'm supposed to do. I'm in a bind. I've got this motivation to do this and a motivation to do that, and that they kind of don't go together. I don't know how to make sense of that or integrate that. So unconsciously they are decoupled, right? So they're split apart. And then there's different ways that we might deal with those. So one of those is what I was talking about before when I said that you might then learn, whenever you're in relationship and you feel angry, you only notice that the anger, you're never angry towards them. They're always fine, but you become mad, right? Like the anger goes on you. So that would be splitting, because you've split the anger off. And is the audio gone funny?
No, it's just my AirPod.
Oh, that's all right. And so the anger goes on you, and they stay good. So they stay on the pedestal, and you become the recipient of the anger, right? So it's like the splitting of good and bad. So part of the therapeutic task is to help people to come to a new relationship of those complex feelings and notice that they can integrate them and hold them both together. So now, like if I'm in an argument with my husband and I notice the rage impulse inside me, I don't freak out. I don't, tell myself I'm a terrible person. I'm not flooded with anxiety. I don't go to attack mode and tell them all sorts, like I'm able to just notice they're both there. And I notice that in an integrated fashion, what it's telling me is that I love him. I want to be connected to him. I want to be, I want to keep working on our relationship, but there's a signal inside I'm not going to ignore that's telling me something's not right in this moment. How can I share that with him lovingly in a way that is connecting, that is in the spirit of trying to get closer and closer to one another, work things out? Right? So that's that's the holding the two feelings together, and learning to do it over time means it no longer comes with anxiety. Right? As opposed to, for lots of people, they might read any signal of anger towards their partner as like, I'm a bad person, or they might just choose it. They might be like self-righteous, like that's right. And what about the 500 other times that he's done this exact same thing? And then we get into that territory. And choosing good or bad is what splitting kind of is. But then the other part still goes somewhere. It still goes somewhere. It just gets redirected. Yeah. So we're trying to learn the complexity of having both those feelings together at once, even though they seem contradictory. They can actually help us to deepen our relationships. But there's also something in that too that's really relevant to being able to notice our autonomy. And um, obviously, there's going to be some line that we get to where actually we might have to decide that I've tried, but this relationship's not for me. Like, this is not working anymore in the best interests of me. And so I have to make the decision to leave it, right? Again, can still be done in a loving way. Doesn't have to be done because we choose to just highlight the anger and start screaming and yelling or whatever. Um, so it's both. I think it's important that we highlight that it's both. It's not just about deepening connections with others, but it's also about really holding ourselves seriously and also allowing ourselves the ability to make firm decisions for our own autonomy. It's both pieces. Um,
Yeah.
I was going to say here. But yeah, so loving. What I was actually going to say to you earlier was it sounds like as you describe yourself having this sort of positive, like positivity within you that you always remember. You just sound like you're really full of love, like you have a really loving disposition. Um, and that's beautiful. That is the thing that ultimately I think that is kind of the stance that is really useful to take is the loving stance. But it doesn't mean that we do that. We have to do that at the expense of noticing the other complex feelings.
Yeah.
We can still integrate not being happy with what someone's doing and see if we can work on it in new ways.
Yeah.
But if you've had a history of that never going well or never being allowed, that's really scary to do. And there can be a lot of resistance towards doing that unconsciously, even if consciously you think that's what I want to do. Right. And there's all these kind of self destructive and relationship destructive behaviors that kind of get enacted. And so we don't need, but it's helpful to have a therapist be able to sit with you and really point those out and say, I think this might be part of what's going on. I think in a roundabout way, you might not be doing it consciously thinking this, but I think in a roundabout way, it's functioning like this.
Yeah.
I think it's getting in
Yeah.
the way of you getting what you want in relationships. What do you think? And yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. And it's kind of ironic because like I've noticed in my life when I have um tried to lead with love in a way that um denies, all of these other emotions,
Mm.
my love becomes much more shallow. And it becomes much more surface level and like the kind of head nod kind of thing, which, for a lot of people, especially, I think entering into, relationships, platonic and romantic at my age, like a lot of people haven't even experienced that.
Mm.
So for them to experience that, they reflect back to me like, oh, like, you're such a loving, caring, empathetic person. And I think it wasn't until I started going my own therapeutic journey and then I started, uh, really dedicating myself to like authentic relating practices and things like that, where I uncovered a level of depth of connection that was like so wildly like beyond what I was doing before that.
Mm.
Where now it's like I understand that love looks different in every circumstance, and it's really about connection to the whole of a person as opposed to just um I used to think love because it was like I wasn't talking about my mother earlier, but like she's a very um she's like a very like cheerleader like energy, like she's like your number one supporter, she's like in your corner when you need her, she's like you know will make a big fuss at your birthday, like Christmas, like all those things. um and that's what I internalized love to be. And where I think she um kind of gave me a distorted idea of that is that she really has a difficulty holding, negative emotions, anger, like especially like kind of more masculine, anger, um, uh, things like courage and ambition, things like that. Um, and so that's how I would love, and um, I'm so fortunate that I had that force of good in my life, but I realized it had
Yeah.
its limits.
Yeah.
And so yeah, what you're saying makes so much sense of, the kind of multidimensionality of
Yeah.
love. Um, and
Yeah.
yeah,
I
yeah,
mean, I think the most powerful kind of love is when we really see our friend, our partner, our family member, whoever, we see them, like you say, in their entirety. We see them warts and all. We see the parts of them that drive us absolutely crazy, right? Like, we see the things that we might still never choose to do or behave like. Um, but there's enough there. There's enough agreement about being in relationship and trying to work to be in relationship and respect one another's difference, but stay in relationship, right? There's enough about that um, that we continue to build and be together. Like that is a really beautiful, very rare kind of thing. Um, and that requires I mean, I'm just repeating myself, but it requires both parts of the puzzle. It does. It requires being able to notice all those positive drives towards connection and seeing the good parts of the other, and it requires the ability to make a stand when something's not right for us, even in the small moments, and being able to just have them both there together without necessarily needing to erase one of them, like CBT might do, right? Like without having to go, well, I'll tell myself a little thought trick and, reconfigure this
yep,
and stay up on the surface, or without having to split one off, which happens before things are conscious, without our psyche having to split it off and only notice the kind of good things about them, and then the bad things go on the other person in the dynamic, or they go on ourselves, or they just go way underground and our gut starts to get really upset, whatever it is. um, there's a manner in which we can come to bring both of those together. It's by no means perfect. I don't want to paint any picture that like I do this perfectly, no way. But it's a nice reorientation point. It's a nice place to come back to with someone and be like, how can we have this conversation and let each other know that this bit's not working for me and it's not working for you, and do it in a loving, connected way, trying to get closer to each other, not further apart. um, and yes, there is, I think what often happens with parents, like if you have two of them, is that there is kind of this ready-made container for you to split because there's two of them.
yeah, yeah.
And for most of us, it's quite easy to divide and to learn exactly like you said, one way of like the good things look like this and the bad things look like this. And when, the truth is that,
Especially when it's so easily compartmentalized into like the person.
yeah,
Like I have one bad parent and I have one good parent, and all the bad is on this side, and all the it's like,
nice
it's
and
like,
binary.
yeah, it's like the kid who like separates all the different like parts of their dinner plate. Like,
Yes,
it's like I don't want the meat to mix with the vegetables because, like,
yes,
oh my gosh, like I don't want that complexity. And it's kind of that like
yes.
splitting in your mind. Yeah.
And that points exactly like you said, that points to the childlike nature of it as a structure, a defense structure. Like it's a very young way of well, it's learnt young, right? Because it is
Yeah.
like, that's what your brain is designed to do at that point. Like it's just trying to grapple with what on earth is happening here, all this flood of information. And so, splitting can often point to, yeah, that there is a very young kind of trauma that takes place. um, so yeah, so learning to be with complex mixed feelings is key to ISTDP as well. Um, but we often don't, again, we're not able to really fully get to that until we go through the layers of um, blockage, of resistance against getting to core feelings that currently are still in our unconscious. And a lot of that, as I signaled earlier, can be guilt. That there is also an unconscious guilt we hold about noticing aggressive impulses when we're younger, and that can also feed into the self-destructive kind of mechanism that we carry, like almost acting like guilty people in our life, like we've committed some great crime or something, like we're not deserving. Um, whereas others are. That can also play out as a manifestation of guilt going underground. But ultimately, at its core, as you were talking about at the start, what did you say? I wrote it down. Crust to core, you said, as we're talking about the different feelings. That's exactly like a little diagram of Davenlou's, which is just basically the breakdown of an attachment wound. And at its core is just pain, what we call just pain, just emotional, psychic pain of you reaching out for your attachment figure in a moment and them not providing you with what you need, right? Doesn't right? Just the pain of that. And then there's these sort of other feelings that build up around as layers around it to not notice the pain, right? And then there can be like grief, there can be guilt, there can be sexual feelings mixed in there, depending on when all of this happened and the dynamics of it. So we kind of start at the outer rim and the crust, and we work with clients to come to see that this anxious anger that they might have come in with, right? That they're always like yelling at people in an argument or something. Once we drill down, at its core might really just be this very, very childlike, very primitive pain that has never had a chance to be expressed. And it's very different to something that's more like a weepy crying that people often fall into, a sort of feeling sorry for oneself. It's much more primal and painful, very, very painful, but there's a passing to it. And then it's done. Mm-hmm. And then we can start to sort of be with ourselves anew. And we can start to build relationships and